Hello everyone, and welcome to Jim's Tabletop Wargaming. Today I will be showing you how to paint an Ultramarine Primaris Assault Intercessor using the Beginner's Paint Kit. This is a direct follow-up to my first video where I reviewed this kit and I wanted to demonstrate how I would paint these models, as well as teach you some of the fundamental techniques you may need. I will not be using any additional paint or paint brushes, only what's included in the box. The only additional tools I will be using are a pair of clippers and a scraping tool for the mould lines, as these are somewhat essential. You'll need a paint palette of some kind. I'm using the plastic package insert that came in the box, and a water pot to clean the brushes with. Ideally you want something you don't mind ruining with paint, like an old jar or a cup. Give it a clean out and fill it with about 2/3 with water. You'll also need a paper towel or a rag of some kind to clean the brushes on. You'll also need some newspaper or something to protect your work surface with as well. First we will cut the parts of a model from its sprue. Follow the instructions on the back of the box to identify each part number. These will correspond with the number written on the sprue, making it easy to identify the item you need. Hold the clippers so the flat edge of the blade is parallel to the part that you are removing. I would try and keep a very small gap between the clippers and the model. This is just to prevent any sort of damage to the model itself, as it can often pull some of the plastic out if you put it directly flush up against the model itself. Once you have all the parts you need, it's time to remove the excess bits of plastic left over. For this I'll use the scraping tool. If you prefer, you could use a file or a hobby knife, but if you are using a knife, be careful not to injure yourself, and if you're under 18 it may be worth getting an adult. But if you're like me and you're using the scraping tool, the trick is just to use a very minimal amount of pressure when scraping. You want to very slowly whittle it down to create a very smooth finish. I had not previously used the scraping tool for this task. I wanted to see how few tools I could use to create a decent effect with, as I feel many newcomers to the hobby will probably lack a lot of the tools that someone like me who's had about 20 years of experience in the hobby, I'm going to have a lot more tools than someone who's brand new. It does work fairly well, but I feel that a file would give a touch more control and speed the process up. Feel free to use whichever method you're comfortable with, of course. Next we need to remove the mould lines. For this I'll be aiming for those which are most noticeable, such as the one across the head and a few on the legs. These are just left over from the moulding process. We just need to carefully scrape them down. You don't need to apply much pressure, just go from one part of the surface to another, just back and forth until it becomes smooth to the touch. It's worth brushing the plastic debris created by these steps off of the model and off of your workspace before painting, as you don't want to get it into your paints. Now you can either paint the model while it's put together and assembled, or you can do it while it's unassembled and put it together at the end. I prefer to paint disassembled, as this gives me greater freedom to access all the details. The downside is you can accidentally rub some of the paint off, and you can, if you get paint on your fingers, transfer paint onto areas you don't really particularly want it on, so just keep that in mind while you're working. The model can be very tricky to take apart once it's assembled, so it's best to decide now how you're going to paint it before you put it together. Shake your paints well before use, as they often separate. A couple of seconds is normally enough. If you do notice it's not a uniform colour, just give it a shake. I'm starting with a base coat of Abaddon Black. This is just to prime the model for the other paints and makes it easy to see the grey coming through any areas that I miss. I also intend to leave some of the recessed areas black, such as the joints between armour and the vents in the backpack, so black is a good starting colour for this. Take your palette and apply some black paint to it. You want to avoid the paint touching the part on your brush where the bristles meet the metal part of your brush there, as this can dry and cause problems with the brush. The paint will usually be too thick immediately to apply straight out of the pot, so you want to add a couple drops of water here or there until it runs a little bit more smoothly. This will prevent any lumpy textures appearing in the paint once it's dry. A good rule of thumb is to have an almost milky consistency. You want to take your brush and just start applying that to your model. I suggest working from top to bottom just to follow the natural flow of the paint, as it will tend to drop downwards. Use brush strokes like I am here, rather than just jabbing the brush into the details, as you want to just maintain the quality of your brush. You can achieve a finer point to your brush by twisting in the palette just like this. You only want to be ever so gently with this, and it will just make a nice little point there for you to get into those details and recesses. The paint won't adhere well to start with, and you may notice a slight separating effect, but keep persisting with it until the area that you're painting starts to look a little bit more uniform. We're applying a very thin coat here, so you will still be able to see a little bit of the grey beneath it, so don't worry about that. We'll be adding a couple of coats. Don't let the paint pool up too much in some of the details and recesses. The thin paints are a little bit more forgiving of this, but you just want to As best practice, make sure that you're pushing the paint around as much as possible and you're not getting it stuck in any areas where it's starting to pull up and cover those details. If you see this effect with your paint just at the top of his thigh there, you may need to add a little bit more paint to your palette as it's a little bit too thin. Once you have an all over layer of paint, let it dry and come back to it for a second coat of black. You may need to apply additional coats of black, so just keep an eye on areas where it looks particularly more grey. You just want to go back and just tidy those areas up. If you are painting while it's apart, do not paint any of the internal pegs or holes where it connects, as you'll struggle to put these together at the end. It is important to clean your brush regularly, as you do not want the paint drying on it. After each step, dip it into the water and wipe against a paper towel like so. You want to avoid pulling the bristles at a 90-degree angle where possible. This is a very common problem. You don't need to be vigorous with the brush, just be very gentle with it. Ensure your brush is clean to avoid getting any of the colours into your other paint pots. Now we have a good base coat, we can apply our MacLeod blue to the armour panels. We want to apply this onto places like the helmet, his chest, his backpack, anywhere that looks like it would be armour. Same as we did with the black, just add a small amount of blue to the palette and thin with water. Depending on how dirty your water is, you may want to replace it as to not darken your paint too much. Now I'm going to apply this everywhere apart from the following places. So I'm going to avoid places like the eyes, the respirator tubes, the grenade, the chainsword, soles of his boots, pouches, holsters, belt straps, vents, any connections between armor panels where his joints might be, as I feel that these would be a little bit more flexible or would be a different colour. So I'm just going to have them black, which will break up a lot of the overall colour of the model, making it a little bit more interesting to look at. Apply as many coats as are needed to make the colour quite vibrant. Try to avoid any areas we'll be painting gold, but it does not matter too much if you do go over them. As I say, we'll be going over them in gold and you won't be able to notice it in the end. Now we are done with the blue, it's time to start with the gold. You want to follow the same previous steps with thinning the paint and applying this detail to his chest, the cross on his forearm and to the teeth of the chainsword. You also need to do the rims of his pauldrons on his shoulders as well. Now you may have made some mistakes here or there or gone over in some places during those previous steps. It's good to tidy up the model now before we move on to any of the next stages, so just paint over any mistakes you have made before we go on. It's also worth partially assembling the model if you are painting it separate, as we're going to be adding texture to our base and we'll be doing a ink wash after that, so assembling it now is a good idea. This texture paint here, the Astrogranite, does not need to be thinned down and will be applied straight out of the pot itself with one coat. You want to aim to cover any dents like this divot in the middle of the base here, and you may need to put it on a little bit thicker there, but you can be as thick or as thin as you want with this as it's just a texture and you want the uneven effect anyway. Good rule of thumb though is just to make sure you can't see any of the black through the top of the base there. You want to keep the rim black for now, and if you do go over onto the rim, just wipe it off with a paper towel. Don't worry if there's any colour on there, we'll be painting it black right at the end. Once fully dry, we'll be adding our shade or wash, which is Agrax Earthshade. Again, one coat straight out of the pot, no need to thin as it's already quite watery. I'll be applying this all over the model, and I suggest you do it from top to bottom. I've started with the base just to show you the kind of effect it creates, as you can't really see it anywhere else on the camera very well. But ensure that you do not allow it to pool on the surfaces. You want it to fall into the recessed areas. If you apply a little bit too much, you can always dry your brush and use that to reabsorb some of the shade, as it will go straight into the brush. Once everything has been coated and left to dry, it will look a bit grimy and stained. We're going to put some of the colour back onto it now with a little bit of dry brushing of the MacLeod blue. Apply the paint to the palette, just barely thin it. Now wipe the paint off the brush onto your paper towel until you only see just a very small amount left on the brush there. Now you can gently and lightly just pull this across the surfaces of the panels. This should be in a perpendicular motion to the recesses and edges that you're trying to cover, and just ensure that the paint only sticks to the highest points. You don't need to do this everywhere, you can just pick the areas which are most noticeable just to make them a little bit more vivid. You can do the same for the gold details too. For the shoulders, I would recommend that you just paint it straight on, as you want to try and avoid the little areas where panels meet, so where the gold meets the blue. Just paint everywhere else on there that is blue with MacLeod blue, just to make that stand out a little bit more. Now we've got a nice change up between the tones there of the light and the darker blue now. what we're going to do is we're going to paint the white details for the shoulders. So you're going to definitely want to empty and clean your water pot now, as it's going to stain the white when you water it down. So just change that over and make sure it's fresh. The details here can be a little bit difficult to get into with this paintbrush, but just make sure you've thinned the paint down just enough and keep a finer point to your tip of the brush there, and you should be able to get into those areas perfectly fine. Try and paint as close to the edges of the details as possible. And now that's done, the model is pretty much complete. If you wanted to, you could just leave it here, as it's already better than what's on the box. But what I'm going to do is show you how to really make it stand out with a little bit of edge highlights. So we're going to do a little bit of paint mixing now. Grab your white and blue and put about 4 parts white on your palette. Clean your brush and then apply 2 parts blue to the white mixed together thoroughly. Thin the paint as normal with a little bit of water, and then you just want to get a nice point to the brush and pick out some of those edges on the panels. So any edge areas, any panel lines where panels meet, any details that you think might look a bit more striking if they were just edged out. So you're looking for kind of like the wear around the edge of a panel. Be mindful to work quickly and ensure you have enough paint mix to achieve the effect before it dries on the palette. You may need to hydrate the paint again on the palette every so often. Once done, you should have something like this, or you can use this as a guide for where I have applied the paint as well. We will next do the black areas like the sword, the grenade and everywhere else that we've left black. So I will start with 3 parts white on the palette and just slowly mix in black as you can see here. You can do this by just putting it next to it and just mixing them across. Same as we did with the blue highlight, we're just going to pick some raised areas and areas that we want to really stand out and pop out a little bit more. You don't need to get them all, just a few here or there will do. Once we're done, we can use the same grey, or we can mix a little bit more white in, make it a little bit lighter, and just dry brush that on the base, just as we did with the MacLeod blue dry brush earlier. You just want to wipe that off, and then just gently pull that across the surface of the base, and that will make it really stand out. You have a nice difference in tone there. Finally, we can add a layer of black to the rim of the base just to tidy it up and make it look a little bit more professional. And with that, we are done. You should now have a model that looks better than the reference image shown on the box, and hopefully it's something you're proud of. Painting can be a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed this quite a lot. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did and found it helpful. I'm just getting this channel going, so I hope to have more videos like this coming soon. If you like what you see, drop us a like and we'll try and keep painting tutorials like this coming as frequently as we can. Also have a question for those who've got this far through the video. What is your favourite army in 40k and why? Leave your answers in the comments below. I look forward to reading them. Thank you for joining us today and have a good one.